Welcome to Hello Unknown, a podcast exploring the hidden parts of the human experience. I'm Jonathan Wright. Today, Thief Taker. We begin with a list. It's an old list from a couple hundred years ago. It's a taxonomy of the London criminal. Here are a few examples. There were sneaksmen and drag sneaks, starglazers and till-friskers, snow-gatherers and kitten hunters who did not steal kittens but pewter and pots from railings. There were snoozers. They would sleep at railways and snatch unattended luggage. Dead lurkers stole coats and umbrellas. Skinners were women who, like sirens, would lure sailors to tavern rooms and steal their clothes once they'd stripped down. And my favorite, the Sawney hunters. Their profession was bacon theft from cheesemongers. English law enforcement at the time was hardly worth its name. Each parish would hire its own watchmen. They were called Charlies. The Charlies were the mall cops of the Georgian era. The tools of these Paul Blarts, in place of the Segway and taser, were the wooden rattle and a staff. The rattle was to call for help, and the staff was, nominally, to protect himself, but in practice it was used differently. These men, hired from the edges of society, fearful and easily bribed, would tap the butt of their staff against the stones so that would-be criminals would hear and confrontation would be avoided. So, with this being the state of law enforcement, what were the victims to do? The baconless cheesemonger, the naked sailor. The common choice, at the time, was the daily newspaper. Daily news was an 18th century innovation. In 1695, a statute lapsed that had cracked down on free media. Out of this new freedom came a form of news that hadn't existed yet. It was a newspaper that was printed and sold on a daily basis. These papers had a 4-page format. Page 1 was an essay from the editor. Pages 2 and 3 were news, loosely speaking. The articles were slanted and very political, even by today's standards. And then on page 4, the classifieds. In between calls for the return of runaway slaves or complaints about bootleg poetry were these little ads, springing up like weeds in daily papers. They offered rewards for the return of something stolen. And out of these ads, out of these rewards really, there arose an entirely new profession. The thief taker. I used to love fantasy books. When I was a child, I fell hard for these novels. It was part of my identity. It was who I was, this boy with a really active imagination who liked to pretend and liked to dive into these worlds, living in them in my mind. The first of these worlds was Redwall. I was in maybe grade 3 or 4 when I began reading about the mice and rabbits as knights and ladies of Redwall Abbey, eating candied chestnuts and drinking dandelion cordial. Next was a detour into Star Wars books, then Forgotten Realms, inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, and later the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, which is now a huge budget Amazon show. It wasn't cool. I knew that. I can't remember exactly the extent to which I hid it, but I did hide it. I remember being teased for pretending at recess. The bullies are faceless in my memory. I don't know who they were, but I remember the feeling that what I was doing, pretending, being in another world of my own creation, somehow wasn't right. Another moment came later. I was 14 and up at my parents' cabin. I had a crush. She was a neighbor, one cabin over. In the memory, I was finally talking to her after a summer of nervous avoidance. And I remember the embarrassment when she mentioned that she'd noticed me. Normally a good thing, not so in this circumstance. What she'd noticed was that all I did, all summer, was read books. And she was right. I would just sit on the dock in the sun, my nose in Forgotten Realms, occasionally, looking wistfully toward my crush, splashing in an inner tube. So these were some of the worlds I lived in for a time. But then, as I reached age 16 or so, something strange and actually really upsetting at the time happened to me. I just stopped liking these novels. When the change occurred, when the worst happened, I was taken unawares. There were no signs. There was no build-up. I still had a collection to read, a bunch of unread fantasy books that I would never pick up again. I still have them in a box somewhere, probably in my parents' basement. I didn't go quietly. I tried to figure out what was wrong. I put one down and picked up a different one. I did that a couple times, but it didn't work. So I went back to fantasy I'd read and reread before, and I couldn't get through them. Overnight, my old worlds had changed. They went from being magical, unbounded, infinite, to being restrictive, boring, and unrealistic. There were a number of small-time thief-takers then, but it was one man who dominated this experiment with law enforcement, calling himself the Thief-Taker General of Great Britain and Ireland. His name was Jonathan Wild. Jonathan was born in the 1680s. The exact date isn't known. He was the eldest of 5 children, and his family was poor. His father was a carpenter, and his mother a small-time grocer, selling vegetables and herbs in the nearby market. They lived in Wolverhampton, in the heart of England, northwest from Birmingham. It was a smallish town, known at the time for metalworking, smaller objects like sword hilts and steel jewelry. That was how Wild, in his late teens, found himself apprenticed to a belt-buckle craftsman. He got married around that time, and he fathered a child, and at this point, the rest of his life might have been as ordinary as the beginning. But in 1708, in his mid-20s, he left his family. He left behind both his wife and his son, and he traveled the 3-day journey from Wolverhampton, population around 7,000, to London, with a population then of 600,000 people. So Wild arrives in London, and it's not looking good for him. Almost immediately, he's put in jail. He'd quickly racked up debts that he couldn't pay, and he landed in a debtor's prison called the Wood Street Compter. But instead of this being the end for him, alone in his debtor's prison, miles from Wolverhampton, instead, it's in jail that Wild's career as a thief-taker begins. Wild learned early to get on the inside with his jailers. In that prison, if an inmate wanted something, he could get it. He'd go to his jailer, and there would be a price for it, called a garnish, paid for in money or in labor. Wild chose to work for his jailers. Before Wild is let out for good, 4 years after beginning his time there, he's asked to catch thieves. He was given liberty of the gate, which was the privilege of being let out at night for this purpose, to assist in nabbing criminals. It's around this time that Wild captures the attention of a man named Charles Hitchin. Hitchin was the under-marshal for Newgate Prison in London. The job was a sort of proto-police chief. That was his day job, in a way, but where Hitchin earned his real money was thief-taking. He had developed a system, and he took Wild in, saw his potential, and apprenticed him, teaching him what he knew and sharing the profits. This worked for a time, until eventually Wild decided sharing no longer worked for him. Hitchin was gay. Many years later, he was caught having consensual sex with a man. This is a side note, but he was convicted for sodomy and put in stocks in front of a crowd who would attack him violently, and he had no means of defending himself. Hitchin wasn't sentenced to death, but he died from his injuries. Years earlier, though, when Hitchin and Wild were still in partnership, Wild had decided he wanted the business for his own. So Wild wrote a pamphlet, written anonymously, but later traced back to him, where he tells a story. It had 2 layers. In the story, Hitchin takes Wild to a molly house for male prostitutes. Wild is drawn along, unwittingly, he says. Whatever. There, the story goes, he witnessed Hitchin, along with the other men, quote, hugging and kissing, tickling and feeling each other. That alone would put Hitchin on the outside of polite society. That's the first layer. Then Wild says he witnessed Hitchin being spurned by one of the boys, which brings Wild to the second layer. Hitchin turns the boy over to the law, along with a number of other prostitutes. So, not only a homosexual, says Wild, but also a hypocrite. after the fallout, Wilde had London to himself. There's more to the story after a quick break. First, thank you so much for listening. Putting these things together for you, this is one of my favorite things, honestly. So, Hello Unknown has no ads, really. At this moment, the only thing I'm selling is my podcast. I want everyone to listen. So here's my request. It's not money. I don't need you to buy anything. All I want is for you to share the show. Text your friends or post on social media, rate the podcast, leave a little review, tell people. Anyway, back to the show. Right at the time I was losing interest in fantasy, I was trying on something new. I'd just written a midterm exam for my Literature 12 class. I'd been okay at English before then, good grades, not amazing, but I remember getting the exam back and looking at the grade and saying, yes, out loud to my teacher, I guess I'm good at English then. So I was losing interest in something uncool, fantasy books, and I had a reason for it. I was coming into an identity for myself. And now I could reject the old one. The loss of fantasy corresponded with me dipping into new books, capital S, serious books, Crime and Punishment, Albert Camus novels, Jacques Derrida, T.S. Eliot. It was philosophy, theology, classics. This may not seem cool to you, but it felt cool to me. It was a contrast that I could carry around with me. As a child, I was a nerd because I liked books. But this felt like the next step, like I'd conquered new ground. You think I'm a nerd? I could say. No, I'm smart because I read books, and I'll prove it. My friends still call me English major. You know, like the degree in university. It's been a while, but I'd use that, only half ironically, to end arguments on literary matters. In a way, I still do this. There are moments when I know this part of me will come out. If I pay attention, I can feel it coming. Sort of like that nauseous moment just before you throw up. I'm usually in a social situation where I'm not comfortable. I'm probably feeling insecure or bored. Maybe I've had some alcohol. Or, and this happens a lot, maybe I just feel like I don't know what else to say. And so I'm kind of mean. Oh, Wheel of Time? Yeah, I used to like that when I was a teenager. I think this is how I respond to my shame, to my nerdy self that lives within me. I armor up in my chosen identity. I'm critical of things I used to love and full of praise for whatever new discovery I've stumbled on. I make fun of Wheel of Time and I settle arguments by saying, I know what I'm talking about. I'm an English major. In short, I set boundaries and draw lines. I write a story that I tell to myself about my past and my present. The past, the nerdy past I have rejected, and the present, well, that's something new and praiseworthy and cool. What I choose, in short, is to be Jonathan Wilde. At the center of Wilde's life was this contradiction. He caught thieves. Wilde claimed, and it's possible that this is true, or nearly so, that he brought more than 67 criminals to the gallows. 67 people were hanged because of him. He was the center of law enforcement in London for a time. The Privy Council, the advisors to the king, even approached him, asking him what should be done about crime in the city. And what did Wilde say? Of course, he said, increase the rewards paid to thief-takers. So that was one side of the contradiction, that Wilde was a thief-taker. The other side was this: Wilde was a thief. This was his system. Wilde, the thief-taker, cultivated his thieves. Young men, sometimes boys really, that he nourished into full-grown burglars. His sneaksmen and drag sneaks and starglazers and till-friskers. His agents. Then he'd send these thieves out into the city to steal and order them to bring him the goods, selling them to Wilde for pennies on the pound. After this, Wilde would wait for the announcement in the Daily News beside ads about runaway slaves and bootleg poetry saying lost snuff box and pocketbook, reward. And he'd bring the items to the eminent Lord such and he would get paid for his thieves' stolen goods. He would never own that part of him, the heart of the contradiction, the thief-taker and the thief. He spent actually considerable effort setting himself apart from the men who stole for him. He once called them, his thieves, quote, the most stupid and infatuated gulls upon the earth. But it went much further than words. He would sell out his thieves, without notice, whenever it suited him. He describes how, if some officer gets on the trail of one of his boys, he would give them up, immediately, joining, quote, loudly in the cry against them. Then, once they're jailed, he'd go back, visiting them in jail to prevent them from flipping, to, quote, allow them a small support by which means you may keep their hopes alive. A false hope, of course. So Wilde caught thieves, and he was a thief. He used thieves, and he hated them. He got paid for their work, and then he sent them to Tyburn, strung them up by a long rope, and let them hang for the crimes he urged them to commit. A friend of mine listened to an early draft of this episode. She sent me an email with her thoughts. Among her comments was a statement, very reasonably, calling Wilde, quote, the definition of literally the worst human imaginable. Which, yeah, I get it. She wondered why I was going out of my way in a podcast to compare myself to this guy. So, Emily, here's the answer. It's because we share something, him and me, that very basic human urge to hang a part of our identity. Like Jonathan Wilde, I am a thief, and I am a thief-taker. I love imagination and pretending and creativity, all the things that fantasy has at its heart, and I also reject it. This denial of myself, of my past, comes from my bruises and broken bones. I don't blame myself for trying to find a new identity, a better one. I'm not the nerd. I'm cool. I'm the smart guy. I like the right things. I read the right books, and I can tell you why, because I'm an English major. The truth, of course, is I'm a nerd and an English major, and many other things, all together, all at once. My past is there, side by side, sharing the same table, eating from the same bowl as my present. I try and cover my past under new layers of identity, but who I am is actually more apparent than I want to believe. My blanket of identity, it's see-through if you look closely. And so, I will be uncovered, and it will happen for my benefit. I'll be caught and put on trial. The people around me will see me for who I really am. Everything hidden will be revealed. Eventually, it all came back to Wilde. It began with one of his thieves, Joseph Blueskin Blake. Blueskin was chafing, working under Wilde. It was a bad deal, having to sell his goods to the thief-taker for much less than they were worth. So Blueskin did something about it. He partnered up with another young thief named Jack Shepherd, and they decided to set out on their own. Shepherd had a job in mind already. They went to rob the home of Shepherd's old boss, a man by the name of William Kneebone. It wasn't difficult. They came away with their booty, and they took it to a fence, a man who buys stolen goods. But what they didn't know, presumably, is that the fence worked for Jonathan Wilde. That's how the news came back to him, that two of his thieves were working in his city, selling his stolen goods, without giving Wilde what belonged to him. He instructed his men to bring in the pair. Eventually they were found, and before Blueskin's trial, the young thief goes to Wilde. He asks him for old time's sake, to put in a good word. But when the trial comes, Jonathan Wild gives damning evidence against Blueskin, and Joseph Blueskin Blake was convicted. There's a newspaper article from that time. It's from the Weekly Journal. It reported on what happened next, right after his conviction. It says that as Blueskin was talking with Wild, quote, he, on a sudden, took out of his pocket a little knife, and catching hold of Jonathan round the neck, attempted to cut his throat. Another article continues the story, saying that after the attempted murder, Blueskin rejoiced. Blueskin said that, quote, he should be hanged with pleasure if Wild did but die before him. Like a goon from a Guy Ritchie movie, Wild did not die. He left London, and as Blueskin was hanged, Wild convalesced. Eventually he recovered from his wound, and he returned to find that everything had changed. Word had got out about how he had one foot in both camps, thief-taking and thievery, how he stole and charged vast sums to victims for the return of their property. And, in the meantime, his thieves began to slip from his orbit. Wild is arrested. He's put on trial. His rap sheet was a laundry list of criminal activity, dividing London into gang districts, employing felons he deemed vulnerable, shipping booty off to Holland, and on and on. His associates began taking Wild's advice, joining loudly in the cry against him. They testify, and eventually Jonathan is convicted, sentenced to death on a single charge for stealing a length of lace from a lace seller. Wild was terrified. He begged for a pardon, which was ignored. He then began to refuse any food, and shortly after this, on the morning of his hanging, he attempted suicide. He drank laudanum, a poison, a mixture of opium and alcohol, but because it had been so long since he'd last eaten, he threw up the poison, and he survived. At his hanging, he got to see what the people now thought of the thief-taker general of Great Britain and Ireland. Wild's crowd, which was reported as being massive, yelled curses at him and threw rotten fruit and eggs. And the hangman, he took his time, stringing him up, wrapping the noose, and dropping the supports from under him. He died on May 24th, 1725. Our episode today is written, edited, and produced by me, Jonathan Wright. Music is by Taylor Swindells of Neighborhood Libraries. Thanks to Emily Rogers, Matt Rogers, Matthew Lee, Jared Ing, Rebecca Wright, and Ian Wright. If you have questions or ideas for future episodes, you can email me at hellounknownpod@gmail.com or just write it in the podcast comments. And if you like what you heard today, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform, because that's how more people get to hear us. Thanks for listening.